Pruning your tomatoes is an essential task to keep your plants healthy, get the most harvest, and avoid your tomato taking over your entire garden. Today I'm going to be taking you through some best practices for pruning your tomatoes to make sure that you get a harvest through the whole season and that your plant doesn't die too early from disease or damage. What's up? My name is Bree from Urban Gardening Canada, and I garden in Ottawa Zone 5. Today I'm going to take you through the best tips and tricks for taking care of your tomatoes during the middle of summer and peak harvest season. So the first thing that I want to take you through is just a really quick setup of how your tomato plant grows, so that way you make sure that you're pruning the right parts of your tomato and you don't accidentally cut off the main stem. So with your tomato plant, you are going to have the main stem of your tomato, the leaf stems, and suckers. As your plant grows larger, it's going to be a lot harder to figure out what is the main stem and what is a sucker, especially if you let the suckers grow out to their full size. And so the best thing that you can do in order to understand where your main stem is to start from the soil and work your way up and follow that stem along. And that is a sure way to make sure that you know exactly where the main stem is. Before we get into pruning tips, I want to just quickly touch on the fact that there are two types of tomatoes. You have your determinate tomatoes and your indeterminate tomatoes. I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but I do have a video on how to grow tomatoes where I go into it a lot deeper, so I'll link that below. But it's important to know if you're growing determinate or indeterminate tomatoes to prune properly, because on determinate tomatoes you really don't want to prune anything more than the leaves, otherwise you will limit the harvest that you're going to get. With indeterminate varieties, you can prune the leaves and the suckers off and you will be able to continue to get a harvest. So at the base of your tomato plant, you can get what looks like new tomato plants popping out from the base of the soil, right where that original stem is that you planted, and those are called suckers. And you're going to want to prune those off just to make sure that you get the most amount of energy going into your full tomato plant and not onto these side shoots. Suckers do appear again higher up on your tomato plant, and that is between your main stem and your leaf. I call it the armpit of the leaf, and so in that armpit of your stem and your leaf is going to be a new plant that is growing, and that is called a sucker. And if you leave those to grow, they will turn into a whole new stem that grows more leaves and more flowers for fruit. And the reason that they're called suckers is because they suck a lot of energy out of your plant. But it doesn't mean that you want to cut them all off. You can if you want to, but that's not what that means. People who remove every single sucker off of their plant, this is what's called single stemming. It's a specific type of way to grow tomatoes, and that was the way that I grew my tomatoes for the first 3 to 4 years of my gardening career. But the reason that I've stopped doing it is for two reasons. The first is that you severely limit the amount of harvest that you get out of your tomato plant. And the second is that because indeterminate tomatoes will grow continuously, I ended up getting tomatoes that had 12-foot tall stems on them and really limited amount of tomatoes. And so I would rather have my tomato plant stay shorter and bushier than have some 12-foot tall stem that I can barely support that has limited amounts of tomatoes on it. So there's a couple of reasons why you want to prune your tomatoes. The first is that you want to have really good airflow. Pruning leaves off your plant and giving good airflow helps slow down any type of diseases that can come on your plant, and also allows the insects to get through and for you to be able to see exactly where your tomatoes are so you can harvest them. The second reason that you want to prune your tomatoes is because certain varieties can grow totally out of control and take over your whole garden. So if you want to limit how big your plants get or how much space they take up, then pruning is essential to keep your plant exactly where you want it to grow. Just be aware that when you do prune your plant, you are going to limit the amount of harvest. If you're growing beefsteak varieties that have large tomatoes that grow a pound or bigger, when you prune your tomato, it means that more energy is going into the few fruit that is on there, so you will get bigger fruit. Or you can choose to not prune your plant and you will get more tomatoes, but you will get smaller sized tomatoes. Finally, the last reason that you want to prune your plants is that later in the season, when time is running out before your first frost is arriving, you can cut off the tops of all of your tomato stems, so that way all of the energy goes into finishing ripening the tomatoes that you have directly on your plant versus continuing to grow and putting out new fruit. So oftentimes I will cut the end of the stem off where the last set of fruit is, just to help drive that ripening into the fruit that's already on the plant. So the first part that you want to prune on your tomato, which is also the easiest part that you could start with just to get the feel for it, is right at the base of your plant where the stem meets the soil. Here you want to remove any suckers and any leaves. You don't want any leaves touching the soil because diseases like blight come from the soil or from the air. So when it rains, that water can hit the soil and splash the soil onto your leaves, and this can transfer blight to your tomatoes. So you do want to make sure that there are no leaves touching the soil whatsoever. And then you'll also want to remove the suckers just so that they don't take too much energy away from the rest of your plant. When you're pruning your tomato, make sure that you are using a sharp knife, pruners, or scissors. You really don't want to be snapping the leaves off of the plant because then you're taking a chance that you're going to strip part of the skin off of the main stem. And when you do that, you're leaving an injury on the stem that is also susceptible to other diseases or pathogens. So you really want to make sure you're using a sharp tool. The next area that is really simple for pruning is removing any leaves or suckers that are crowding out other plants in your garden. If you have a large sucker that you didn't notice before that's reaching across your whole garden and covering up your other plants, it's totally safe to cut that sucker off and remove it completely. You can safely remove larger, older leaves on your plant as well as suckers without harming your plant, but just make sure not to prune more than a third of your plant off in a single day because otherwise you're going to stress your plant out too much and it'll stop growing or stop producing for a while it recuperates. So just be mindful about how much you're taking off. When you get later in the season, in late August or September, and your plants are huge, it's a lot easier to heavily prune your plants and not have to worry about taking too much off. But when you're earlier in the season, you just want to be careful about how much you're taking off. And then the final way you can prune your plant is by removing suckers. So this is totally up to you and your preferences. If you want your plant to grow huge and bushy, you can leave every single sucker on your plant if you want to. If you want to limit it to a single stem or only 2 or 4 stems, then you're just going to want to stay on top of your suckers and remove them. So it all just depends on your space, your variety, and how you want to grow your tomatoes. And if you like big tomatoes or small ones, it's totally up to you. So suckers can grow really quickly without you noticing them. So you do want to stay on top of checking it regularly and removing any of them that you want to. And when they're really small, suckers are super easy just to pinch off with your fingers. You don't need to use pruners for that. You just have to get between the stem and the leaf and you just pinch off that small sucker. As they get larger though, and the stem gets thicker and more woody feeling, you do want to go back to using a sharp knife or pruners to make sure that you're not damaging the stem of your plant. And finally, the fun thing about suckers is that if they get to a decent size, you can actually prune them off and stick them in water and they'll grow new roots, and you can start that off as a whole new tomato plant if you wanted to, if it's early in the season or you have a longer growing season. It's just a fun way to get extra new plants without putting in effort from growing them from seed. While you're pruning your tomato, you'll want to monitor it for any types of pests or disease. So if you see any type of blight that is coming on your tomatoes, you're going to want to prune that off right away because blight will continue to spread. So if you see any black spotting on your leaves, remove those leaves right away and throw them out, and then clean your pruners so that way you're not continuing to spread it. And that's everything for today's video. If you liked it, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions on how to prune your tomato, you can leave them in the chat below. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.